within the Community Safety and Safeguarding Partnership within Swindon Borough Council. And there's 4 of us doing a quadruple act today. So if I get each of them to introduce themselves before we move any further. So Jackie, do you want to say who you are?
Good morning, my name is Jackie Barstow. I work for the Safeguarding Partnership and I'm supporting this event with the preparation and behind the scenes stuff mainly. Just to let you know that we are recording the session, so some of you will probably have seen the message that's come up, and it will be available on the website in due course.
Thanks, Jackie. Jeanette?
Hiya, Jeanette Chippin, Child Exploitation and Missing Children Manager at Swindon Borough Council.
And Jen?
Yeah, good morning everybody. Jen Holton, I am the head of the Neighbourhood Harm Reduction Unit for Wiltshire Police and one of the force leads for honour-based abuse, forced marriage and female genital mutilation. So good morning.
Okay, so hopefully everyone's in the right webinar. You're all here for the FGM. So everyone who's booked on, you were given or sent the practice brief and the policy. So if hopefully everyone's had a chance to look at those. And can you? And I think Jackie's already asked you to do this. So if you haven't, can you put your name and job role into the chat, please, so we can see who's attended and know whether we're covering enough of the workforce with the training. So can you keep your mics off unless you're speaking, and we're going to try with the cameras on where possible. I mean, if we start to get some issues with that, then we'll have to revisit that, but it would be nice for everybody to see who's here, although I can't see anyone at the moment. So female genital mutilation is a sensitive topic, so beware of your location now and who may be listening in or overlooking your laptop or computer. Just be aware of that. As Jackie said, the session will be recorded. Please don't share outside of the webinar, and it will be put onto the website, the Safeguarding Partnership website, but we will be stopping the recording when we get to the case studies. So just to be aware that you don't need to take copious notes because you will get access to the presentation afterwards. As I've already said, any questions, raise your hand or put in the chat. So that's okay. And then at the end, there is an evaluation form that we would like people to complete. Jackie will put a link into the chat later on in the webinar so that you can link into that. And just as an incentive, once you've done your evaluation, you'll then be able to access a certificate of attendance. So so there we are. So I forgot to move the presentation on because I was so content on making sure I'd said everything. So there's a health warning. Obviously, as I've already said, FGM is a sensitive subject. You may find some of the content difficult because of the subject matter. So if it triggers anything from you and you feel you can't continue, then please just leave and then seek support. So from either your line manager, from HR, the union, or Care First. And as Karen has put in the chat, we have got domestic abuse champions within Swindon Borough Council. So if you're an SBC employer, you can access one of the champions, and the information for those is on the intranet. So the aims of today's session are to improve our understanding and knowledge of FGM, including the prevalence and barriers to reporting, examine the professional roles and responsibilities when we have to report FGM, demonstrate knowledge about female genital mutilation orders, and also to explain the Safeguarding Partnership procedures for resolving professional disagreements. So that's the escalation policy. So that's what we're hoping to cover today. So I'm now going to hand over to Jeanette for the next couple of slides, and Jen will be part of that too.
Okay, thanks everybody. So what I think is really important is really to be clear about what we mean by female genital mutilation. And it's where there is a deliberate cut, injure or change, and there's no medical reason for this. It's frequently very traumatic and a violent act, and it can cause harm in many ways. For example, severe pain, immediate or long-term health, infection, mental health problems, and difficulties in childbirth. I think it's really important to actually say that FGM is a deeply rooted practice, which widely carried out in some ethnic populations in specific ethnic populations in Africa and parts of the Middle East. It serves as a complex form of social control of women, of women's sexual and reproductive rights. The age of when FGM, we do tend to think of under fives, but actually it can vary loads, and it can be according to the community, and the procedure may be carried out on a newborn infant, during childhood, in adolescence, or just before marriage, or during a woman's first pregnancy. So I think that's something that is really important to bear in mind. And there is no biblical or Quranic justifications for FGM. Religious leaders from all four faiths have spoken out against the practice. The exact number of girls and women who have undergone FGM is unknown. However, UNICEF estimates that over 2 million girls and women worldwide have undergone FGM, which is a huge number, isn't it? And we just need to keep that in mind. Next slide, Lynn, please. So this is kind of there's different types and of FGM, varying from actually the removal of the whole clitoris, and in very rare cases the prepuce, the fold of the skin surrounding the clitoris. So that's kind of type 1, which you can see from the diagram. Type 2 is a partial or total removal of the clitoris. I'll let you kind of read the rest of that, but if you can imagine what that must be like as a woman, you know, for those parts of our bodies to be removed. Fibulation, the narrowing of the vagina opening through the creation of a covering seal. The seal is formed by cutting and repositioning the inner or outer labia with or without removal of the clitoris. And then 4, all other harmful procedures to the female genital for non-medical procedures: pricking, piercing, incising, scraping the genital area. So I think it just is to actually really bring us back to what this means and how traumatic this must be for a child to go through that, or an adolescent to go through it, or an adult woman to go through this. It is a really, really, we are talking about cutting, and we're talking about the cuts then being sewn up, stitched. And we just need to keep that in mind when we're actually talking about how kind of, I mean, when we talk about trauma, this would be a very traumatic impact. And we know from adult women who have actually spoken to us that that is something that they talk about, is the trauma of what happened to them, because often it happens in a way where it is around the family, and it's seen sometimes as a rite of passage. So I think it is really, really important that we kind of keep that in mind, and that actually for that child, it will be people that know that girl, it will be people that they know and love who are supporting this procedure. Next slide, Lynn. And this goes on to why it absolutely matters that FGM is a criminal offence under the Female Genital Mutilation Act. There's been a law for 20 years, and we're still only got single figures of convictions across the countries, which is, you know, shocking. we've got to be cultural sensitive, but actually we've still only got single-figured convictions. It's an offence to take females abroad to undergo FGM or to get it done in the UK. It's child abuse, and it's a form of violence against women and girls and should be totally treated as such. And female FGM has immediate and long-term health consequences. Really important again that we actually think about that. You know, we think about the infections right through to the pain of childbirth. It's believed that FGM may happen to girls in the UK as well as overseas. So again, this is why this training is important, that we actually are vigilant, we actually think about this, we think the unthinkable around this. And the exact numbers of girls who have gone FGM is unknown. And as I said before, estimates that over 200 million girls and women worldwide have undergone the procedure. Okay, so who's at risk? And the girls living in communities that practice FGM are the most at risk. It can happen in the UK or abroad. In the UK, the Home Office identified girls and women from certain communities as being more at risk. There is a long list there. Once again, just because the country's not on that list, it's not exhaustive. We really must, you know, constantly think about this, because we do know sometimes families move from one country to another. So it is really important that we actually recognise that there is other countries where there may be concerns if a child is being taken abroad. However, we actually know that children are at higher risk if it's happened to their mother, sister, or another member of their family. However, the flip side of that is also we shouldn't actually totally assume that that is the situation, because we know some of the best campaigners and advocates and who are spreading the word are women who have been cut themselves. So I think it's really important that we actually are mindful of that. We're sensitive to what's going on and that our response is proportionate. Any questions so far?
Sorry, Jeanette.
It's all right. It's all right. Is any questions so far before we go into a slide? Anything you want to add, Jackie, Jen, Lynn?
For me, I just think that we need to also recognise that some of the young girls who are living in one of those countries, it may be within the villages, so it's not only always a antiseptic and clean environment, and the utensils used can be anything from pieces of tin or pieces of glass, not just sterilised equipment. And I think that's really important when we're talking about, you know, the added risk of infection.
I think that's right. And I think added to that is also if a child has been cut, whether that be abroad or in this country, families are not likely to want to go and seek medical treatment if there is a concerning infection. So I think that's really, really important. We've got a hand up.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I wanted to ask before we move forward, why this isn't considered also sexual abuse. I understand the, you know, violence against women, but it's so imperative to their sexual being that I was wondering why it's not classified as such.
I think that's a brilliant comment. I don't know the answer. I don't know if any of my colleagues are. It should be, because as you say, it's about taking away.
It absolutely can be classed as sexual abuse. I think part of it kind of depends on the procedure, although maybe it shouldn't, but it absolutely can be classed as sexual abuse. I think the key thing that they try to push is that it's child abuse, because it primarily happens to females under the age of 18. And so it's the kind of child protection factors take over and encompass the fact that it's also sexual abuse, because it's also emotional abuse and all those kind of other things. And I think child abuse is used as the kind of catch-all for the abuse types, but it absolutely is a type of sexual abuse and should be treated as such.
But it's not, with most of the information, we don't actually use that. We don't put that as a category, but I think it's really good to highlight it, Tara. Really,
all right,
really
thank
good.
you.
Yeah,
all right,
really
cheers,
important.
Okay, so as you can see, there's oh, sorry, there's a video, because we've had problems, I'm going to come out of the presentation and then Jen's going to share the video on her screen. So just bear with me a second. Okay, over to you, Jen.
Yeah, just bear with me 2 seconds and I'll share it for you.
This is where we all hold our breath. Oh, it's happened.
Okay.
I was cut for my future husband, so I don't have sex outside marriage, so I don't enjoy sex. Primarily, my body is just there to carry babies. This is me as a survivor, as a therapist. FGM is not a cultural traditional practice, but actually it's child abuse. That particular day was quite interesting, and it was only my neighbour's daughter that said to me, "Oh, you must be really looking forward to today." And I was like, okay. And I thought, well, it's not my birthday, what the hell's going on? And she said, "Oh, you're having your gudnin done." So gudnin is FGM in Somali. She must have been 8, 9 years old, so it's a child telling another child what's about to happen to them. She started to explain what it was, and I'm sitting there thinking, but mummy told me no one should touch my body. So it was a conflicting messages that was going on in my head. But as she's explaining this, I could hear a scream coming down from the other side of the house, like screaming. It was my sister. It was like an out-of-body experience. Before I could even do or think anything, it was like, get Layla. Get Layla's turn. And I mean, I ran off. Obviously, I'm 7 years old. There's only so much running I can do. So they grabbed me, pinned me on this table. Women who held me down, these were aunties, family members, you know, family friends. Before I knew it, I was screaming and I could feel my flesh being cut off. But I just remember him saying, you're being naughty, you know, you just behave yourself, you know, it doesn't hurt. And I blacked out from that moment. So had FGM done, was home for 2 weeks recovering. The weekend after, we were back at the beach. Life was normal again. That's just the way it was. Once you undergo something like this, there's no way back. There's no way back from this. My mother wasn't just cut once, she was cut twice because a neighbour thought not enough flesh was taken away. And for me, when we talk about FGM, there's so much focus on the type and what happened. What we need to focus on is this idea that we can just go and examine children's genitals. What I experienced was actually one of the worst forms of abuse. The doctor that cut me would never be seen as a paedophile because he's checking my genitals under the label of a doctor. People giving me any reason, they would say, it's their religion, it's their culture. I mean, none of the holy books mention it. It's practiced amongst all religions, but none of the books mention it. However, fundamentally, FGM, it's there to control women and girls' bodies, especially their sexuality. I mean, every 11 seconds, a girl is being cut. So the fact that we're not outraged, it's absolutely crazy to me. The world hasn't tackled FGM because the majority affects black children. There will be an outrage if this was white girls. I mean, look what's happening in Hollywood. It's great that we're now naming and shaming sexual harassers and abusers. But black women have been doing that for a while, but no one listened. You know, we can't say every child matters and then pick and choose the ones that matter. I 100% wholeheartedly believe FGM will end. But the only way that's going to end is we need to end all forms of oppression against human beings. My name is Layla Hussein and I'm a global citizen. I was cut for my future husband, so I don't have sex outside marriage, so I don't enjoy sex. Primarily, my body is just there to carry baby.
So we're just waiting for Jen to come back on and Lynn to actually put the slides back on, and I'm handing over to Jen.
Can you see the screen again, Jeanette? Jen?
We can, Lynn.
Great.
We've actually got the
okay, right.
YouTuber, yeah.
Okay, good morning everybody. So quite an uncomfortable video to watch, but something that we think is quite important for you to see because it actually talks about what it's like for the child, that voice of the child that we know is so important. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the law surrounding FGM, and the law, actually, I'm not going to go through every single bit of this. As we said, you'll be given the slides and you can read it, but the law around FGM is actually really comprehensive. The Female Genital Mutilation Act from 2003 was then kind of superseded by the Serious Crime Act 2015, where it was made even more watertight. So the key elements really from this are that it is an offence to perform FGM in England and Wales. It's also an offence to assist a girl to carry out FGM on herself, and to assist a non-UK person to carry out FGM outside the UK. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Lynn. These are really the key bits about it taking place abroad. So we know that victims are more likely to be taken abroad to have these things done, because it is far easier for them to hide the practice abroad than it is in the UK. So this part about the law also protecting victims who are taken abroad is really key. So it's an offence for a UK national or a UK resident to perform FGM abroad, to assist a girl to carry out FGM on herself abroad, and to assist a non-UK person to carry out FGM. It's an offence to fail to protect a girl from the risk of FGM. And when we talk about who counts as that kind of protective factor, it's actually really quite broad. So it doesn't have to be a direct parent or a direct relative. It can be anybody who assumes that kind of responsibility for the child. So it could be neighbours, family, friends, anybody who is seen as holding kind of that responsibility or that parental role at that time. And then it's also an offence to aid, abet, counsel, or procure a person to commit an FGM, encourage, attempt to commit, or conspire to commit an FGM offence. And there's a sentence of 14 years imprisonment for these crimes. Next slide, please, Lim. So that brings us on to the FGM mandatory reporting duty, which is set out in the Act. And this is that for healthcare and social care professionals and teachers in England and Wales, there's a mandatory reporting duty to report any known cases of FGM to the police in children under the age of 18. Now, when we talk about the word known, I think it's fair to say that you have to have reason to believe. You don't have to have physical evidence that this has taken place. When we say here, known cases are those where a girl informs a person that an FGM has been carried out on her, which is obviously slightly more simple, but actually where you as a professional observe signs on a girl appearing to show that FGM has been carried out, or any other kind of signs and symptoms that you pick up that you think it possibly has been, and that's when you've got a mandatory duty to report it to the police. So reports should be made as soon as possible, but certainly by the close of the next working day, unless there are very specific circumstances in which you think it will heighten the safeguarding risk to do so, but that's very, very rare. And cases of failure to comply with the duty will be dealt with in accordance with performance procedures in your own organisation. So I think that bit in bold at the bottom there about mandatory reporting does not replace safeguarding actions. Mandatory reporting is fantastic because we absolutely need to know who our at risk are within our communities, but that certainly doesn't mean that all the safeguarding therefore falls to the person you've kind of just reported it to. Actually, we all have the responsibility here to make sure we're picking up our fair share of that protective kind of bubble we need to surround that victim in. Next slide, please, then. So that brings us on to female genital mutilation protection orders. So as we heard earlier on, the prosecutions or the convictions for people who have tried to convict perpetrators at court are really, really low, and that's a real worry. But also there are multiple reasons why it might not be appropriate to take a victim to court. We had one very recently that was prosecuted in Avon and Somerset for a girl, and for a very young girl, and it was the taxi driver had disclosed to a professional that he had had FGM carried out on his daughter, and the young girl was taken away. Now, I want you to kind of think about this from the young girl's perspective. She is very young. She has had a cultural practice performed on her that was painful, that she didn't understand, that has left her feeling very unsure and upset, and you know, quite scared of what her family is capable of. And we then scoop her up as professionals and want to examine her, understandably, because that's what we need. We need evidence. But actually, when we keep thinking about this from the child's perspective, she's had one invasive procedure done, and we now want to look again. And so we look again and we take photos, and it gets to court, and the defence argue that the pictures aren't clear enough, that you can't see clearly the damage. So they insist on a second exploratory investigation on her genitalia, in which further pictures are taken, and it's deemed at that time that it's healed enough and the scar tissue could be from anything, and it's thrown out of court. So the judicial system at this point is not effectively set up to deal with these things. So the law is really you know, is really well put together in terms of its wording, but actually pushing that through the courts is really difficult. And that's where things like female and genital mutilation protection orders come into it, because these are civil orders, they're not criminal orders, but they do carry the kind of criminal I can't think of the word I'm trying to look for, those kind of criminal sanctions. So if a breach of an FGM-PO, for example, is a criminal offence, so the two burdens of proof in a criminal court is beyond all reasonable doubt, but in a civil court is on the balance of probability. So you're working to a much lower threshold, and you're therefore looking to convince the judge who will hear it that actually, on the balance of probabilities, this child could come to harm. And so it's a much lower threshold, which is far easier to secure an order against, but it means that it's a hugely impactful safeguarding tool for that very reason. So a female genital mutilation protection order, an FGM-PO, is there purely to try and protect a victim from having FGM undertaken, or their siblings. So it doesn't just need to be on one person. If you can take out an FGM-PO to cover an individual victim and all of their siblings. And so what it looks to do is to be quite flexible in terms of the needs of that individual. So anybody can apply for an FGM-PO, providing the courts gives permission to do it, which they pretty much always will. So it can be the local authority, it can be the police, it can be teachers, charities, family members, healthcare workers, even the victim themselves. There's no fee, it's completely free to go and make this application to the court. And there are certain courts across the country that will hear these hearings with a judge who's specially trained. And the conditions of the FGM-PO are really down to the person applying for it to state what they need in order to have their protection. So in lots of these cases, we actually ask for surrender of passports, and we can name any number of potential perpetrators. So I've taken an FGM-PO to court previously where we ended up actually naming 17 people on the FGM-PO, because the risk from wider family members and the wider community was so great that we ended up having to put a huge amount of people onto this order. And when we're talking about surrendering passports, that's for the victims as opposed to all those perpetrators. And there's quite often multiple passports, so we can go in as the police and we can take what we think is the only passport, only to find out that they have been taken abroad on a different passport. So there's all sorts of things within those FGM-POs that we can stipulate, be that you know, they can't stay with certain people, they can't be left alone with certain people. And that's the beauty of these FGMPOs. They're so underused, but they really give us that flexibility as professionals that the judicial system doesn't, and that bail conditions don't in quite the same way. I can see we've got a hand up. Do you want to shout your question out, Louise?
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering what the conviction rates were in the criminal courts, given the the real stringent the criminality. I'm just wondering how what the rates were and how successful it is in the criminal courts to get cases like that through.
So in the criminal courts, I think we've had 3
Okay.
prosecuted.
And
None.
you know,
I think we've had 1 that was successful. No, 3 that were successful. Sorry, I think we've had 7 go, 3 that were successful.
oh right, okay. Do you know the sentencing outcomes?
The not off the top of my head. I could certainly find out for you. The one of the ones in particular, which was to a young baby, mother got quite a significant sentence. I think she might have even got the full 14 years.
Yeah, I was just interested because it acts to send a really clear message, doesn't it?
It does. The problem with FGM, as we've gone through, is the 4 different types. So they differ in severity so much. So where the courts are good, and in that case with the young baby and the mother, the baby had to be rushed to hospital because of the amount of blood loss. And so at that point, it's very easy to obtain all the evidence you need to demonstrate and to prove that this act has taken place. The real difficulty comes from those young girls who are taken abroad and have the more minor types of FGM. And I say minor is a horrible word, because the impacts on them certainly aren't minor, but the evidential kind of impact, the evidential view that we get, a couple of months down the line once it's healed is nowhere near of that kind of criminal court evidential value, even though the mental kind of trauma that it's produced is still hugely significant. And so because of those varying different types, when you have one of the more kind of, the type 1, which is hugely severe, criminally and evidentially, it's far easier to prove than some of the lower ones, and that's where we get into the real difficulties there in the courts.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, okay. Jen, can you clarify what timescale that was over, and if you know, and kind of what is that across the country?
Which one? Sorry,
the numbers of convictions that you say have happened.
So that's across the country, and that's been since 2003. So yeah, I'm sure it's through. I think we're 3. We pushed really hard for number 4, but it got thrown out, and it is something that, if I'm honest, I think the courts are still quite scared of. I think they don't understand it, and it is something that we're very reluctant to push in a similar way to I'm sure lots of you will be aware of the kind of coercive control legislation and what difficulties we had kind of enforcing that to begin with, because coercive control obviously is not that physical abuse, which again is much easier to document and evidence, and we were kind of slow starting off with that, and we're starting to get better, although there's clearly still a long way to go, and FGM is further behind again because it's a subject that people don't really like talking about, and that's why when we do these events it's so important, because it's not pleasant. You'll all be sat there listening to it and just thinking, oh, I don't really want to know about this, it's not very nice, and that's a completely normal and human response to have, but not talking about it and not accepting that it happens doesn't make it go away. It just means that those victims continue to suffer in silence. So it's really important that we start to talk about it and we start to recognise that it is happening here in your local communities. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Lynn. Okay, so this is a speaking part for you guys, really. So shout them out or put them in the chat. Jeanette's going to monitor the chat, but if you're happy just to come off mic and shout them out, then please do. So what barriers do you think might exist for professionals when identifying or reporting FGM? Who wants to be brave and bold in the first one? Don't make me pick. Go on, everybody hates that.
I can go. It's Raf from Swindon Borough Council.
Well done, Raf. Thank you.
I would say a lot of it is especially like a cultural barrier, and in which then trust is always not, like, the relationship is not going to be built very easily. Specifically, there's like quite big cultural and language differences. Because we also have
Absolutely.
unconscious bias as well that we might not be aware of and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah, completely spot on. The cultural barriers are really difficult, and that's kind of twofold, really. One, that from the victim's perspective, quite a lot of these children are brought up in an environment where they're told they can't trust professionals. You know, you can't, and that's not done by accident, but they're brought up in an environment where they're told they can't trust the professionals. You know, they mustn't talk about it to their teachers, to anybody else, because they don't understand, and they will try and remove our culture from us. So that cultural barrier is really, really difficult, as well as them backwards from professionals, in that we often feel quite threatened by cultures we don't necessarily understand, or things that we're not sure that we should be getting involved in. So those barriers are absolutely huge in both directions. So yeah, no, really good one. Thank you, Raf. Anyone else?
Yeah, it's Louise here. I would think about shame as well. I think with a lot of abuse victims, there is an element of shame, and fear of what could potentially come next for the perpetrator as well. So those emotional barriers as well.
Absolutely. As we've said, they're generally performed by friends and family, and people you know really well. So absolutely, the shame of speaking up that's happened, and then the fear of it, of the repercussions from the perpetrator is absolutely huge. Yep, you're completely right. Anybody else?
Hi, it's
This is
Jade.
Esther. Oh, sorry. I think professionals not being able to identify what's happened, so a lack of knowledge in terms of knowing what FGM is in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah, completely agree. Yeah, not much more to say on that, really, but yeah, completely agree with you. Who else did we have shouting out?
Well, first of all, sorry, you know, barriers for professionals, you know, it's very delicate matter because it's about genitals. So, you know, if you work with the child, you cannot identify easily, because you cannot say, oh, can you now drop your pants? And I want to see, you know, if there is is this FGM, you know, performed on you. So
Absolutely.
that's the massive barrier, because no one wants to be seen or accused, for example, for unnecessary, you know, I don't know, you know, as you, one of you, sorry, I don't remember which one of you mentioned earlier, you know, oh no, I think it was on the video, you know, it might be anyone just wanting to, you know, to cover up their pedophile, you know, inclined, you know, behind it. So it's very delicate.
Yeah, completely agree. It's a subject that we're all quite uncomfortable talking about anyway, and then to have to broach those with a child is even more complex. So yes, I completely agree.
I think it's also important that we're proportionate as well, because actually for a child to be examined, that is really quite traumatic as well. So it is a bit about how we gather the other evidence through the other signs.
Yeah, agreed.
And then make that assessment. So I think that's really, really important that we, you know, just like with any forms of sexual abuse, it is something that we've got to really, really think about, and you know, make sure that we gather the evidence and we are talking to each other. We've got a couple of hands up. Jen, sorry, I've lost my voice.
Rachel, should we come to you?
Yeah, I think sometimes as well, when we are working with young people, some may not be able to communicate clearly with us, depending on their age. Sometimes different children use different names for the genitals as well. So they may
Mhm.
say something to a professional where they use, like, for example, sometimes we use flower for vagina, and they may say something about their flower, but the professional doesn't actually know that's about the vagina. So kind of those conversations, I suppose, with children about what we call things and stuff like that needs to happen kind of, I suppose, earlier. And it
Yeah.
may be that some of the young people that we work with don't think we understand because we're not from their cultures or from you know, from their background, so they may think if they tell us, we won't understand.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. That's definitely a huge barrier. Emily?
Hi there. It kind of bounces off what Rachel has just said, actually. The lack of understanding, perhaps from young people, in knowing what's happened to them. They might not understand it is what it is. But I was then going to ask, is the conviction affected by lack of support from the victim? Because we know from domestic violence, not all victims support, because it's a very, very complicated issue. So with you mentioned the case with the child. Did the child understand, where you were trying to get the conviction and it couldn't go through court, because the defence was saying that it had healed too much?
Yeah.
What are the child's views on this? Is it explain what's happened, that it's going through court?
It is, but I mean, I think that child was 4. So it's often on children who are so young that they aren't able to comprehend what we're asking of them, and what's happened to them, and that has to be picked up much more in terms of that ongoing welfare support for them to start to digest what's happened and what they've been through. And that's why we talk about this. Sometimes these criminal prosecutions actually aren't in the best interest of the child. And I personally have done quite a lot of work with the College of Policing around the fact that we're happy to use evidence-led prosecutions for domestic abuse victims, because we realise that for a multitude of reasons they may not feel able to prosecute their abuser, but actually we don't use those for children.
Mm-hmm.
And why don't we use those for children? And there are lots of arguments as to why we don't really use those for children, but actually there's lots of arguments for why we don't use them for women as well, but we still have found a way through it. And it's one of those things that the judicial system is not yet sufficient for these cases to go through as easily and as simply as they can. It's a challenge, definitely, and I think that word challenge is going to be quite prevalent today. One, because identifying potential victims is a challenge, and 2, because actually the necessity to challenge each other and other professionals, which we'll come on to in a minute, is also really difficult. But that's why we're doing this today, to start having some of those conversations, to start hopefully equipping you with some of that knowledge to feel more confident when you need to identify it. We've got another hand up. Stephen?
Hello. Yeah, I just excuse me, had a question which could be a potential barrier to reporting it. When we were going through the legal side, we talked specifically about children under 18. Obviously, that is the primary group that are most likely to be affected. If we are made aware of potential FGM that's happened to an adult, or perhaps we find out about something that's happened to a child, but that adult is now over the age of 18, how does that affect our ability to report it?
So when they become over the age of 18, it's not mandatory to report it, and if they choose not to engage, then they don't have to. And that, you're absolutely right, that again is another real challenge, because they have all sorts of females who have undergone FGM quite often have all sorts of issues in later life, in terms of urine infections and all those kind of things, as well as then physical issues in labour, and various things like that, depending on what cultures, and not to be too graphic, but as Layla says in the video, some of this is around that kind of sexual gratification, and actually some women go through the trauma several times over because the initial kind of procedure is performed, and then it's a rite of passage for the man to kind of claim that on the wedding night, which again, obviously, when things have been kind of made to be much smaller, that's kind of a ritual for him to kind of claim that woman as his own and as her only. And so there's a second kind of trauma that goes with it, and then for the fact that actually lots of perpetrators then try to, particularly after childbirth and things like that, then try to have FGM re-performed to put everything back as they think it should be. So it's something that doesn't necessarily just happen to a victim once, and as they go on into later life, they actually have multiple problems with it, as well as all the psychological problems that naturally will go with that from the huge mental trauma. So it's a real challenge later on in life, and that not having that that mandatory reporting is really difficult. It's really difficult on professionals around the room, because you guys can't come and give it to the police and say, this is what's going on, and I need you to take it now. Actually, there's a lot of onus on yourselves to provide that safeguarding and to try and encourage that victim to engage with police. So it's really quite difficult. I think maybe I'm conscious of time, but I think I might just.
Jen, we've got a couple of comments in the chat.
Yeah, go on.
So so from Kerry, we've got, unless you're changing a child's nappy, you wouldn't see evidence of FGM.
Yeah.
Again from Kerry, nursery staff sometimes worry about the breakdown of relationships with parents if they make a referral about FGM, and they are wrong. And then Steve has also said, I think there are psychological barriers amongst professionals which are internalised, particularly the fear of being labelled racist. That is why transparency and cultural awareness are so important.
So, Steve, that is absolutely a bit of me there, because I can tell you that I have been called a racist as the HBA FM FGM lead for Wiltshire Police. I have been called a racist on literally hundreds of occasions, and there's a very good reason for that, and it's because the perpetrators and the families are normally trying to get you to back off, because they know we are terrified of being considered culturally insensitive, and therefore they pull that out and use that as a race card to try and get us to back off. Now, clearly, that does not give us free rein to be culturally insensitive, but actually it shouldn't stop your decision making in terms of that victim if you've got concerns, and your organisational heads should be prepared to support you if your decision making is made for the right reasons. So if we come on to some of the signs and symptoms, because I think what you've put in the chat, sorry, it was Kerry, wasn't it, in the chat, about actually that identifying of it. Actually, it's an area that's largely covered up. It's not something that we can look at routinely. It's not like bruising to the arms or, you know, to the face. It's much more difficult than that. So it's actually about picking up some of those smaller signs and symptoms. So we're talking about things like young children, toddlers, whatever, not being able to sit still. Now, I know lots of toddlers can't sit still, but I mean the real discomfort of being able to sit on their bottom, kind of that constant moving backwards and forwards because they can't sit down, needing to urinate regularly and then taking a long time to go because then they're unable to, or they're in quite a lot of pain. At kind of school age, refusal to take part in PE or to get changed in front of people. Talking about going to a special party, long trips abroad that are unexpected, and quite often over the summer holidays or over the Christmas period, where schools are less likely to notice a month-long absence, and children are specifically kept away for a month to give it time to heal, so that some of these signs and symptoms aren't so readily available. They quite often talk about lots of presents they've got, getting to become a woman, So there's all sorts of little signs and symptoms like that you need to be looking out for. The biggest thing I would say to you is that FGM is a criminal offence without doubt, but more so than anything else, it's child abuse and it's a safeguarding concern, and we need to protect that child. And what I need you to do at the end of the day is to look at a case you've got in front of you and decide that if you've got concerns that a child may be at risk of FGM or may have had FGM, are you content that you have done everything you can to keep that child safe? And actually, I think that if you can ask yourself that question and answer it honestly, that trumps all of those arguments in terms of, but what if I'm a racist, and what if I offend the parents? Because actually, if the child has had it done and they're at risk or are about to go and have it done, are your own insecurities about breaking down a relationship with the parent or about being kind of considered culturally insensitive justification enough for you not acting? And actually, for the most part, they're not. So we need to look at this in a way that says, I'm not accusing you of anything. I am saying that I have got significant concerns about this child, and we can therefore explore what those concerns are and what they mean. And that's when other professionals can then get involved. It doesn't have to be you holding it individually. It should be a multi-agency response to how we're going to deal with this. But first and foremost, it's a real safeguarding concern, and we need to make sure that we're all content at the end of the day when we go home, that we're not leaving a child in a situation which we believe could be potentially harmful, just because we've maybe gone to speak to a colleague about it and they've said, no, don't be silly, that's not it. Or we're not 100% sure we know enough, so we're not going to kind of push it. We need to make sure that we can kind of be really honest with ourselves that I've got concerns, I'm a professional, I've got professional curiosity, that's a good thing. I'm prepared to have those challenging questions and say, I'm not happy here. There's something that's worrying me, and it's scary to stick your head above the parapet like that, but it's absolutely essential in these cases, because it's only when a couple of these signs and symptoms are picked up and a brave practitioner says, I'm really not happy that everything's right here, that we get to these girls in time. And that's why it's so important. I'm going to move us on there because I know we've been talking about it for a while. Thank you for your contributions, and just really, we know how difficult this is. This is absolutely not an opportunity for us to tell you all the things that you're doing wrong. This is absolutely an opportunity for us to discuss the barriers and to accept that those challenges are there and how difficult it is, but actually the things we can do to start to improve them. Okay, thank you, Lynn. If we can go on. Okay, so we've talked about, I mentioned briefly about professional disagreement and escalation. And escalation, again, is something that I think we're all quite unconfident to do. Lots of us are quite unconfident to do. And challenge and professional disagreement is really healthy. There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. And someone who has made their decisions for the right reasons with a really clear and transparent view should not be worried about being challenged. It's a brilliant thing to do. I encourage my staff to challenge me all the time, because it actually means that you end up having really healthy, honest, open, transparent conversations about an issue. So when this happens and you as a frontline practitioner say, I've got concerns that this child that I've been working with is about to undergo FGM, and you take that to your colleague or to your first line manager or to maybe, social care would bring that to the police, and we turn around and say, no, we don't think that's FGM, we're not interested. It's just a child being a child. And I would love to say that those things don't happen, but they absolutely do, because people don't understand FGM, they don't understand some of these cultural practices, and therefore they can be really quite dismissive of them. And what we need you to do at that point is to be prepared to challenge that individual and say, yeah, I see a point, I'm still not happy. And if they are not prepared to engage in that two-way conversation with you, that's when you need to escalate. So the escalation process is all documented in the SSP various documents on the website, all sorts of things like that. And we'll come to a couple of slides in a minute, which kind of is just shows you what it looks like, but it is all documented properly on the website. And one of the things that we get out of lots of our serious case reviews or child safeguarding practice reviews is that there's a real lack of awareness and use of the escalation procedure. Professionals say, I knew something wasn't right and I wasn't happy with the way it was left, but I didn't know what else I could do. So that escalation procedure is really, really important, because if you have got concerns and you have had nothing to mitigate your concerns, you should still be concerned and you should escalate that. So we have lots of different reasons for differences in professional opinions, and some of that's about the different thresholds and whether people kind of agree or disagree with certain actions being taken. If this is a problem, this isn't for you to handle by yourself, and there is an escalation process purposefully so that you can have support with that. Again, remember the child underneath, not the insecurity you've got of challenging a maybe more experienced colleague or another professional. So if we can move on, please, Lynn. I think there's a couple of bits in here that are really key, and I'm not going to read them all out, but that top one for me is one of the most important. Effective working together depends on an open approach and honest relationship between agencies. That honest information sharing, those honest, transparent, and really challenging conversations where we get to thrash out what some of the issues are and the different perspectives. We also need to make sure that we record everything that we're doing and the actions that we're taking. So when we have conversations with people and we raise our concerns, write that you've raised your concerns to this person, when and what the nature of that conversation was. And if that conversation hasn't gone as you would have liked, then write who you're now going to take this to raise the fact that your concerns and you don't think it's been resolved. You must document what action you've taken and what action is kind of continuing to go, because if then something happens over the weekend or next time you have some annual leave or whatever else, it needs to be really clear on all the case files, on all the internal systems, exactly who's been spoken to and what the nature of those conversations were and what the nature of any actions that were agreed off the back of it were and who was responsible for them. Obviously we want to resolve those kind of conflicting challenges informally if we can, easily if we can, try talking to the person, and if that doesn't work, then we can start to look at the more formal kind of escalation process. So if we can move on again, please, Lynn. Okay, so when there is a need to escalate a concern, professionals should raise the concern with respect, balance, and clarity, act swiftly and deal with issues and concerns as they arise, ensure concerns are raised correctly using the agreed process, be open and ready to listen to the responses when provided, and focus on the risks, safety, and well-being at all times. Those are really, really important, and it's really clear guidance for when you should be raising something. Okay, so if we just move on quickly, thank you, Lynn. So like I said, these are just kind of examples of the escalation policy that can all be found, and there's details on the escalation policy there, and a 7-minute brief on professional disagreement and escalation, which is really worth a watch, just so you're more confident and comfortable with what that policy is. So please do go and have a look. If we can move on, please, Lynn. Thank you. So again, just this is around the adults escalation policy, but it's all there, and this will be available to you for access to the link. So please do go on and have a look. Thank you, Lynn. If we can go onwards.
Okay, so that's over to me now.
Can I just say one more thing?
Oh,
then?
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
My apologies before we hand over to the case study. The other thing I would just like to to raise just very quickly is that when we're talking about some of those relationships and you're worried about breaking down those relationships, I have also had those fears, and I have had some really difficult conversations with parents who actually I was then confident were not a risk to their child, and the child was not a risk of FGM. And actually, as difficult as those conversations are, I have always managed to maintain a good relationship with those parents by going in and being really open and transparent and clear. These are my concerns. These are why I'm concerned. And most parents are grateful that their child's safety is being taken so seriously in these settings, and other children's safety is being taken so seriously. So that's, I completely understand why you're worried, but it is possible to have those conversations and not break down all those barriers, because most parents, whilst they might be a little bit shocked and unsettled to begin with, are actually just grateful that we're taking their child's safety seriously. Sorry, Lynn, over to you.
That's okay. Thanks, Jen. Okay, so we're going to stop the recording now, and we're going